Now, one of the most interesting things about this trilateral dynamic, as opposed to the Americans versus the Soviets when we were younger, is that the relationship between China and Russia becomes extremely important to understand. Now, everyone remembered and was talking about the friendship without limits that was announced at the Beijing Olympics before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Certainly, at a minimum, we can say that this is a very asymmetrical relationship.
That's right.
China holds a lot more cards than the Russians do.
You know, we were talking at the beginning about things that are different from the Cold War.
Yeah.
When the Soviets showed up in China in the 1950s and the 1960s, they were top dog, right? They had the money, they had the investment, and that's the relationship that Kissinger was trying to get in the way of. We are now, a few months after Kissinger's death at age 100, back in the same situation, except this time, as you say, the roles are reversed. It took a while for the Biden administration to come to the conclusion that this relationship is real. And I realized this about a year and a half into the administration, when one day I was at a briefing with Colin Kahl, who was the number 3 at the Pentagon, and he told reporters on the record one day, you know, I know a lot of people dismiss this, relationship without limits, friendship without limits, but there's something real going on here in the axis of resistance that puts China and Russia and Iran and now North Korea supplying for Ukraine together. And we've got to watch this with care because it's one of the biggest changes. The next day, President Biden had a press conference. He hadn't obviously heard or read about what his own Defense Department was saying. And he called on me for the last question in the press conference. Never ask that, never do the last question, right? And I asked him this. I said, do you believe this is real or not? And he thought about it for a minute and he said, no, these two just can't get along. They dislike each other, all that.
And he's also said the U.S. and China are not in a Cold War. He said that consistently.
That's right.
Yeah.
I don't think he would say there's nothing there today. And they're not going out of their way to repeat the we're not in a Cold War. Because I'm sorry, if you are cutting off the lead technology to the Chinese and trying to deprive them of artificial intelligence aid and watching over investment and so forth, you are back in a new era of containment. He may not call it a Cold War. To the Chinese, I think it certainly feels like one.
So when we talk about the China-Russia relationship, I mean, certainly the Chinese have not been providing the Russians with the direct military equipment that the Iranians have, that the North Koreans have. Also, the Russians can't be comfortable with the idea that the Chinese are becoming the dominant economic player with political influence in Russia's backyard. Countries like Kazakhstan, for example, very significant. How do you see that playing out going forward?
At this point, Vladimir Putin has no choice, right? He needs that technology desperately, especially at a moment that the West is doing some sanctions, although you and I could sit here and debate how effective
they are.
They are,
yeah.
Right. And actually, I think the technology sanctions have been more effective than the
economic sanctions. I completely agree with that. Yeah.
That's right. So he needs that Chinese technology. In some ways, he needs it more than the arms. He can get the arms, he can get the drones from Iran, he can get artillery from the North Koreans, even if half of them are duds. And over time, that relationship will build up and they will become, I think, better suppliers to him unless the U.S. can get in the way of that. But he does not have a choice except to deal with the Chinese on Chinese terms right now. And Xi Jinping knows it. But it's useful to Xi because, look, Xi Jinping what was his biggest concern 3 years ago when Biden came in? That the U.S. would finally get serious about moving everything to the Indo-Pacific and confronting him over the South China Sea and defending Taiwan and so forth. So if you're Xi, the two best things that can happen to you is that the U.S. is tied up in Ukraine or ripping itself apart about the aid and consumed again in the Middle East. That's what they needed.